Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Helen Holmes. I'm a qualified psychologist, psychotherapist, a therapeutic counsellor. I'm also an ADHD and autism assessor, and I'm a mediator. I'm also qualified to work with children, young people, adults, couples, and families, and have been working in education and mental health for over 35 years. Um, I'd like to talk to you today about Inside Psychosis, which is a book I've written with around maybe 20 years of research. Um, Inside Psychosis was published in July 2025 by Routledge, and it's a clinical and therapeutic exploration of working on male and female acute psychiatric wards. So, having introduced myself a little bit, I would also like to maybe add that I studied philosophy and theology for my first degree, which was pivotal in terms of me encountering depth psychology in the form of psychoanalysis. Actually, it was through Freud's books on religion that I first became interested in psychoanalysis and then trained as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. And since have trained in many different modalities of psychotherapy, such as the person-centered approach, mentalization-based therapy, interpersonal therapy, and eye movement desensitization reprocessing, alongside other forms of therapy which I've been interested to learn about, to equip me to be able to help the most in need. I've reached a point in my life where I now can help therapeutically people with diagnosis of schizophrenia and psychosis, bipolar disorder, eating disorders, trauma, and self-harm. I like to work with people who other therapists may not feel comfortable to work with, may not be equipped to work with, or may just choose not to want to work with, which is understandable. It's their choice. I don't find it acceptable that people with extreme difficulties, such as schizophrenia or psychosis, are reach out for help and are rejected time and again by different clinicians. Although I understand their position, I just find it unacceptable that these people have nowhere to go. And so my doors are open to people with complex needs, and they are welcome into my therapy to see whether we can work together, which is usually the case. Over, let's say, 35 years, I've been continuing professional and personal development to equip me to be able to work with these people safely. And my book, Inside Psychosis, is actually the result of having been very interested in psychosis and schizophrenia and having a supervisor who encouraged me to work with people with psychosis and schizophrenia. And I worked on psychiatric wards in London over many years, coming face to face with people who were experiencing extreme states of crisis, paranoia. It may have been that they were withdrawing from alcohol or other drugs, and this was a very difficult time for them. And they may have seen me, or it seemed like they did see me, as someone who wanted to hurt them, whereas my whole intention of being on the wards was to try and understand these extreme states of mind, where people were either informally approaching psychiatric services, secure wards, to keep themselves safe because they felt that they may harm themselves, or they had been sectioned by the police, or family members had been concerned, or had, in one way or another, these people had, against their will, found themselves on secure wards. And my whole intention was to try and help these people. And I found that I could. And so from that learning on psychiatric wards, I took that to other experiences in different hospitals, and used my experience to set up groups, which were, on the whole, groups defined by the people on the wards. And I took time to go round all the patients, let's say, or all the individuals, which may be a better term, asking them what kind of group they would like to have set up. And I took down the notes from what they said and invited them to the group and asked them to name it. We also set up ground rules, which we all agreed. And I wrote this on a flip chart and brought the ground rules to each meeting so that there was some semblance of shared understanding about the behaviours that were okay and not okay, to keep everyone feeling safe, and also to help people to feel that they could express themselves. People from a wide diversity of cultures and backgrounds, as some of you may be aware, are typically on psychiatric wards. I also offered one-to-one therapy for the people who I met on the wards, and offered one-to-one therapy for people in a supportive manner. It could be that I just listened to the person. Well, it wasn't just listening, I was a sitting, still, calm presence for them in a private room. Well, I can talk about the privacy of the room in a little bit, but the idea was that the person was being offered a safe and confidential space where they could hopefully feel that they could talk about what was on their mind. And people in psychiatric wards have a lot on their mind, whether it's organised or not. I could start to help them to make sense of what is going on for them at that time. And people, of course, are in various stages of crisis on psychiatric wards, depending on the state of mind that they come into the ward, of course. They could be on substances, which may be the reason that they're there, or recovering from alcohol, and therefore their state of mind is going to change, maybe quite quickly. Some people are withdrawing from drugs against their will, and that is going to create another set of experiences, thoughts and feelings for that person. Sometimes, often very, very difficult. There's people who are homeless, sex workers, drug addiction, that combination that comes into the wards. And people who've been living on the streets are often in a quite disoriented frame of mind. Everyone who I've seen that comes onto the wards is disoriented, often not knowing who they are or why they're there, which is a very frightening situation for them, feeling completely lost, and very, very vulnerable, and usually having had, if they have been sectioned, a very stressful entrance onto the ward. Often, especially women, but also men as well, showed me the bruises that they had received from the police, and other staff members, as they entered onto the ward, which, to keep that view in balance, if someone is not wanting to be taken to a psychiatric ward, they are going to fight back, understandably, and the police are going to have a difficult time in trying to contain that person, especially if it is to save their life, or to contain them in relation to harming others. And not forgetting that a large majority of people on psychiatric wards are there to save their life, to keep them safe, because they are feeling suicidal, or have tried to attempt to take their life in various forms. And therefore, although hospitals have a place of safety, which is for more acute people with a more acute state of mind, the acute wards are a kind of step down from that place of safety, where often the police bring people, for example, who may be lying in the road or who are being attacked by members of the public or who are attacking members of the public. And so they would be taken to a place of safety. And then after maybe 48 hours, they are then often allocated to an acute ward, acute psychiatric ward, which is secure, which means that it's locked. So I have had a growing interest in the crisis, the crisis state of mind, or the state of mind in crisis, for many years, and have been supervised in my work, both one-to-one, sometimes where there's a couple where one member is in a state of crisis, or in families, and have been supervised. And I'm very grateful for the learning that I've received through that experience. So that tells you a little bit about the journey of my book, and maybe it is helpful, or it's maybe interesting to add that after my first degree in philosophy and theology at Heathrow College, which was part of University of London, now sadly closed, I then helped set up the Big Issue in London, which was my first encounter, really. It was quite a in the deep end experience of encountering people in the cardboard city, which was in Waterloo, now is the IMAX cinema, where people were living in cardboard boxes in very acute states of mind, and they were there for various reasons. They may have left the army, they may have come out of prison, they may have escaped from their family to the streets of London and found a fraternity at Cardboard City. But of course, in terms of being so exposed to the elements, these people living in Cardboard City or living on the street now need to take uppers and downers to be able to cope with being so exposed to the elements in this way. And so this creates, and also there's a lot of substance use and self-prescription, alcohol use to weather these experiences and circumstances. This leaves people really quite volatile and vulnerable to being attacked by others, or attacking people, and they can end up being arrested, etc., and in quite a serious mental health state, which could bring them to a hospital setting, which probably is a good thing for the time being, whilst they are given 3 meals a day, 3 or 4 meals a day, and regular fluids, a safe place where nurses will be monitoring their safety and state of mind, where there's ward rounds, where psychiatrists and other members of staff are assessing, the nurses are assessing how those people's mental health is going. And so, yeah, it's been a very kind of lively and vivid experience for me. And I wanted to try and capture my experience in this book, Inside Psychosis, as a way of really trying to offer other people encouragement and interest and intrigue to try and work with people in crisis, because on wards, you will, if you ever go onto a ward, you will predominantly see the people there sitting on their own, a large number of people sitting in rooms, where they may be having visual or auditory hallucinations, and which can be very persecutory, and depth of paranoia, and being in their room on their own, really doesn't offer them very much comfort. And this was one of the reasons why I actually introduced groups and helped set up groups on the ward, so that to try and dispel isolation to offer people a safe space where people could be creative. I would prepare the room by bringing out games and arts and crafts of various kinds, books, colouring books, just so that somebody can be have some meaningful activity in the presence of others, and start to feel a little bit more engaged or socialized, and also to start conversations and learn how to communicate again when someone may have been going through a psychotic experience, can help someone on the road to recovery, just as the one-to-one meetings were a way of setting up a form of communication where the person can feel heard, may feel safe, may find that what they've shared makes them feel lighter and better understood. That was the aim. And I did find that this was an absolutely fascinating field on the wards. And I had to tear myself away because, as someone who's a psychologist, a psychotherapist, I'm those. I've gained those titles because of my personality. Having been curious about myself and others, and about human beings. And so that says a little bit more about the journey of my book. And there are some case studies there where everybody there has given consent, otherwise I wouldn't have published it, to their stories being captured in words in the book. And I've tried to incorporate different approaches used by myself. So, for example, there's a case study where a systemic approach was used, and to try and help elucidate about families and how families contribute to a member being psychotic or being labelled psychotic. And this probably leads me on to my next kind of thought or main theme in this brief talk, which is about psychosis and the nature of psychosis, and whether we could I could maybe try and elucidate that term, and some of my thoughts about it. So we may all be aware that in the United States there is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and we're on to the 5th version currently, which I think was published in 2013 in the United States. And the DSM-5 is a collection of a very well documented set of observations by psychiatrists who have tried to illuminate the different mental health disorders as they see it. And so schizophrenia is one of the more severe mental health disorders. Well, in the DSM-5, they're all severe, and but to gain a diagnosis, someone would need to have fulfilled the criteria set out in the manual, and schizophrenia is one of them, and psychosis is another, alongside many other diagnoses. And I know that today contemporary thinking is that the term schizophrenia is rarely used. Psychosis is preferred by many contemporary psychologists that I'm aware of working in London. I think the word schizophrenia may have gained very negative press, and so it's avoided. And I am aware that schizophrenia is different from psychosis in my view, but I also come with my own shortcomings and blind spots, and it may be that because I've worked in hospitals where the DSM-5 is used, that I'm acclimatized to thinking that there are separate disorders, and that schizophrenia can't really, in a true sense, be replaced by the word psychosis. But I also go along with that psychosis can include be incorporated into schizophrenia, can overlap with it. And it's unfortunate, of course, that media has portrayed people with schizophrenia only in terms of, violence, aggression, and not the other aspects that people demonstrate that I have seen, a gentleness, usually very intelligent, insightful people who maybe feel very misunderstood in this current culture and society, the societies that we live in. So maybe we could talk a little bit about psychosis and what that actually is, because that's the name of my book, Inside Psychosis. I haven't I haven't entitled it Inside Schizophrenia. So psychosis can be seen from, a lot of different viewpoints, as may not be surprising. So I've talked a little bit about DSM-5, and the European equivalent is ICD-11, which is just that they're from different areas in the world. So, but they, on the whole, kind of not collaborate, but they say the similar kind of descriptions of the different mental health disorders. And if we're thinking about a medical model, which is the DSM-5 and ICD-11, then from a psychiatric perspective, there are different aspects or different phenomena of psychosis which define it. So in DSM-5, there are different criteria which a person needs to meet to be considered that they are suffering with psychosis. So, for example, delusions are quite fixed beliefs that someone may hold about themselves or others, which to a varying degree, which I've observed, can or can't be challenged. So, for example, someone who believes that they're being controlled by a doctor in Germany, and that the doctor in Germany has inserted a chip into their tooth by which they control them, and then the person is completely completely convinced that this is true, then it's going to be very difficult and probably unwise to try and challenge their view. So once having heard that someone has a very strongly held conviction about, for example, that a German doctor is controlling them through a chip in their tooth, then it's not going to really help that person to say, no, that's not true, because they're completely convinced by it. And usually what's really needed is for that person to, over time, and sometimes, medication can help either remove that fixed idea, the delusion, or it can loosen, so that the person starts to be open to thinking, actually, yeah, does that make sense? How would a German doctor, or how would a German doctor know about them, and how would they insert a chip into their tooth? Questions like that can start to be thought about, and the person starts to realize, oh, that doesn't actually make sense. And that can be quite a difficult experience for somebody, where their worldview that had been so strongly held starts to become dismantled by themselves, and perhaps by others, including doctors, and therapists as well, gradually. So therapeutically, supporting someone through that change is a really kind of helpful thing for that person to have, where their worldview is taken apart, or they take their worldview apart, is quite an experience of change, of process for them. And so then the second category that psychiatry considers is a criteria for psychosis is hallucinations. So where somebody may have auditory or visual hallucinations that most other people would say, no, I can't hear, a goat in the corner, or I can't see, an oasis or a desert in the living room. That's just two examples. And so it can quite easily really become clear when somebody is going through an episode of psychosis due to hallucinations. Also, disordered thoughts can be an indication that somebody is going through psychosis, where their thoughts don't make logical, sequential sense. And, you could say, well, who does make sense? And it's a good point. But with someone who's going through psychosis, it's obvious that they're mixing maybe three different ideas in one sentence, which doesn't make sense. And also that, their logic isn't very apparent in what they're saying. It is quite obvious to the observer when someone is thought disordered. And that again, medication can help with that, where the logic is reinstated. And also in therapy, that can be gently challenged, and depending on the person's state of mind as to whether they can think about what the therapist is saying, and take that on board. I mean, it very much depends on the person's state of mind, which is understandable. Another indication of psychosis in a person is if they have disorganized motor activity. And what I mean by that is that somebody would be dancing like they're in a nightclub whilst they're talking to me, or they may do kind of unusual actions, which you can tell it isn't to do with them wanting to do that. It's because they may think that they're still at the nightclub, or they may have got locked into that experience, or that they're unaware, understandably, that that they're in a world of a different world to the other people in the room, but don't realize that. And so, for example, on a ward, a person danced in a kind of yogic sort of fashion as she crossed the ward, and was bumping into people and was not aware of other people's existence. And of course, this is a very vulnerable state for a person to be in, because out in the street, if they were to do that, then they could walk into a road, onto a train line. Other people, members of the public, could become annoyed and attack them. And so it's an extremely vulnerable state of mind to be in. Another criteria for psychosis psychiatrically is negative symptoms. And negative symptoms are ones where the symptoms are not kind of in the person's interests. So one might be paranoia. So where a person is so fearful that they become terrified and in a paranoid state, thinking that people are going to hurt them, that the police are after them, and so on. And so this again speaks of the person's vulnerability. And if we think about psychosis from a psychoanalytic perspective, for example, then someone like Carl Jung, who you may have heard of, he considered that psychosis was like a waking dream, which we've all had at least one dream in our life, but the dream is whilst we're asleep. So when someone's awake and they're having a waking dream, this could be a quite helpful way to access what psychosis may be like for people who are going through it. And Carl Jung thought about psychosis being like a mythic eruption. He thought about different layers of the consciousness and preconscious and the unconscious. And he thought that it may be a helpful way to think about psychosis as a mythic eruption, where at one level there's myths in the collective unconscious, which also may involve religiosity, that erupt through the cosmic kind of thoughts and visual hallucinations that a person may tell you about. And this is one way of thinking about it. And he thought about it as a profound and symbolic, these mythic eruptions being having profound and symbolic meaning. Um, and so this may be a helpful way, as Jung has said, to to consider um, to consider psychosis, a kind of fragmentation of the self. And if we think about that phrase, fragmentation of the self, and someone going through that process, then we can then think about what that person may need. For example, they're going to need safety, they're going to need security, they're going to need understanding, and empathy and attunement. They're going to need food, they're going to need direction and guidance. They're going to need to be heard so that they feel a little bit understood at whatever state of mind they're in. Um, and that may help to think about, what does a person need going through this very fragile, sensitive state of mind, and how can they be helped through it? Certainly, when I was working on wards, people were often, as I said earlier, not really understanding why they were there, or even knowing who they were, or what day it was, and so that they were really kind of completely confused as to where they actually were. And so I would just, get alongside them, and say to them that, I can help them to think about that, because actually, this is a ward where you were brought last night or 2 hours ago, and it's a place of safety for you, um, and help that person to perhaps go and get something to eat, or a cup of tea, so that they can start to have something inside them, to start recovering with. Um, and I would spend a long time walking with someone at their pace, um, trying to talk with them, saying that, that things are going to be okay, that my name is Helen, who I was, and acting with kindness towards them. These people very quickly realize that, yeah, I am safe, and that I want to help them, and that they then start realizing that, they are in a safe place with me. Now that's quite a gift to give someone, and I don't think about it as giving someone to get something back, but helping someone to just feel that sense of safety through what can be very terrifying experiences, is what I mean by offering that gift to people, which, takes perception, it takes experience to, be gentle and kind, but often very firm as well with people, so that, they know, start to understand where the boundaries are between myself and them, which will help them to be able to feel their sense of identity coming back to them, which often they've lost through the experiences of psychosis. Um, and, a systemic way of thinking about, which is a family and systemic way of thinking about psychosis, really was based on the psychoanalytic view of psychosis, where people who are a family member who are expressing this psychosis, showing that there's something wrong, or something that's damaging happening in the family, where this psychosis emerges, and the one member in the family is expressing that. And I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about psychosis, because often one person is labeled as psychotic, or maybe the problem, and actually it's very rare that one person can be the cause of a problem. It's always going to be in relation to others. So, for example, working with children, I always want to meet with the parents, and when there's a person with psychosis, whenever I can, I meet with the family, to see what's contributing from the family, in terms of how that can be interpreted regarding what the person with psychosis is expressing. And there's always some kind of link that can be made, and that's quite helpful because not only does there need to be work with the person with psychosis, but also with other family members who can learn to be less highly expressive, for example, or that there may be conflicts between the parents, arguments which may break out into fights, which this very sensitive, often very intelligent family member finds it difficult to know how to cope with. And so, when different family members can start to see how they're impacting others in the family, then this can be quite a good way forward regarding starting to perhaps have smaller group sessions. So, for example, between maybe a father and a daughter, or a mother and or mother and the father, or between three people, to try and improve the communication, which is often something that is broken down in families anyway, but to try and understand the function of the psychosis in the family. Often I found, or sometimes I've found, that people with psychosis are actually, their psychosis emerges as a result of wanting to try and keep the family together. And they have reported to me, people have reported to me, that they have, often people with psychosis have thoughts or hear voices regarding their responsibility in terms of keeping family members safe. People with psychosis report how they're very concerned about their family members, about harm coming to their family. And this can be a real kind of strong preoccupation for them. And they hear voices saying that their family are going to be harmed, and they become very concerned and terrified often about this because they care so much about their family. Often, the rest of the family are not aware that this is going on for this family member, and with the voices that they're hearing, the voices can often prohibit people from sharing what's on their mind, can not only prohibit but threaten them. If you speak about this, then your family will be harmed. So it makes it doubly or more difficult for that person, obviously, to share about what's happening in their mind. And so, quite unbeknownst to the family, the family member with the psychosis is suffering inextricably when no one else knows about it. And this is why I think, again, that groups can be very helpful. I have helped facilitate, I've co-facilitated many hearing voices groups, and this can be very helpful in terms of, I've heard feedback from the group members that it can be very helpful, that they thought that they were the only one who were experiencing hallucinations and hearing voices, and when they go to the group they hear that other people are experiencing in their different way similar kind of phenomena. And helping families kind of in a psychoeducational way can really help them to start to understand not only the impact of what they're saying or doing on the family member, but also the other way around. What's happening for the family member, for them to realise and act accordingly. And within family work, the sensitive family member, the person with psychosis, often who's very sensitive, can see through the family dynamics and what is being said and what's not true about secrets being prevalent and so on. And this can be very hurtful to them. And again, it's quite difficult then to be able to, depending on the circumstances, to be able to talk about it. And what can be most helpful from family towards the person with psychosis is to offer empathy, to try and understand what's happening for that family member. And as I was kind of indicating earlier, that can then lead to an understanding of what is needed. And going back to Carl Jung, which I think may be quite helpful, which is why I talk about it, is that he saw psychosis as a process of reorganization of the person's psychic functioning, and that it was a process of healing for them. So a process of self-healing. And therefore, if the family can, support positively support the family member, then they're going to feel a lot safer and more contained regarding what's happening for them, which can often be very, very terrifying. So if we think about psychosis as a process of reorganization and self-healing, then, the DSM-5 diagnosis starts to take on a different flavour. And, psychosis can be seen as a crisis of personal transformation. We often what's talked about is a breakthrough, rather than a breakdown. Very different reframing of the situation. If meaning can be understood, or if the meaning of what's happening for the person can be tried to be understood rather than it being dismissed as nonsensical, then that's a very different position to take, and the person starts to feel that the attention is a right form of attention in terms of trying to get close to and empathize with what the family member with psychosis is experiencing, rather than it being dismissed or them being put down or carted off to a psychiatric ward, which of course I understand can be a very necessary step at times as well. And if these states of mind are responded to properly, the stress levels understood for the person who's going through psychosis, alongside, the stress levels for the family, then for the person who's going through psychosis, their stress levels can be reduced, then they're going to feel less anxious and more able to think. And people with psychosis also need their emotional truth of their experiences to be acknowledged, and that alongside that they're going through crisis, and that there's going to be high levels of anxiety in terms of going through a crisis, and the way to try and the way to try and approach this would be to understand the anxiety, try to reduce the anxiety, try and reduce that level, and so that the person doesn't move into isolation and withdrawal, where they've reached a point of not seeking help or thinking that they can't get any help, and then they're back on their own and perhaps plunged back into some family dynamics. So, for example, where someone may be on a ward, and they're starting to perhaps get better through the medication, perhaps, and also other input of various kinds, maybe from nurses, maybe from friends, maybe from family members, therapists, psychologists, and so on. But then they go back to the family situation. Then if the family haven't changed, then again, this is going to gradually corrode the progress that has been made, and the person moves back into the family dynamics, and a similar situation may arise. And it's quite difficult, though, to try and change a family, as you may imagine. But those that are willing, family members that are really, truly, genuinely willing to try and understand the situation and improve it, a lot of progress can be made. And often a main kind of difficulty in families is where the perception of the person with psychosis, that their perception of their world is discounted, and they can't trust their own. They learn that they can't trust their own perceptions because the parents or other family members are discounting what they believe to be true. So that leaves them in a state where they can't trust their own perceptions, which is a very vulnerable and unfortunate position for anyone to be in. And if their perceptions are deemed by family to be nonsensical, or that they're contradicted continuously, then the person is going to feel invalidated, and this is where the risk increases. Risk of self-harm, of suicide attempts, and so on. If that person feels that they have got nowhere to go, then often that's an explanation for attempts at one's life, where the person didn't feel that they had anywhere to go, where they would be understood, validated, valued, and so on. And if someone's perceptions are invalidated, continuously, then that person is going to feel unreal. They're going to not know what's going on, why, who they are, why they're thinking one way, and other people are telling them, no, that's not the way it is, in such a definite terms. And their perceptions being invalidated is going to invalidate them as a person. And of course, there's all sorts of different sets of circumstances within families, that there's abuses of different kind, which, with psychosis, it's, I think, quite helpful to think of it as a state of mind where there's been intrusions, and that, violations of that person's personal boundaries is often, um, talked about when somebody starts to discuss and share about their history. And I don't think I've known someone where there is a psychosis in their life, where there isn't traumatic experiences. And therefore, we need to be, as clinicians, trauma informed. And this is sometimes quite difficult for families to face, and to take responsibility for and acknowledge that they have played a part, perhaps in the trauma occurring, whether it's from them or from someone else. Is extremely difficult and sensitive work in therapy, but it's possible to illuminate and to bring out into the open safely, and to therefore acknowledge and work through, so that better communication can be instilled in the family for all concerned. And so at this point, I think I may just touch on religiosity and psychosis. So this, I noticed on psychiatric wards, and in my work in private practice with people with psychosis, schizophrenia, and so on, I could say the psychoses and the schizophrenias, which cover a broad range of states of mind within that realm, that there's a high degree of religious content, and this could be, thought about in terms of delusions, where someone may identify with God or identify with Jesus, and therefore think that they are that person or that being. And in terms of religiosity, perhaps again Jung has talked to this in terms of the mythic eruption, of how at a certain level of stress maybe and vulnerability, that these myths and religiosity are demonstrated. There's been a lot of research about people with mental health difficulties, with psychosis, schizophrenia, how whether religious communities can help these people. And of course, it depends on it depends on the form of the religious community. A cult may be quite different, but the mainstream religions, we could say maybe Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, as Jainism. There's many other forms of religion, that. But the idea of a person with mental health difficulties being in a community of people which are hopefully well-meaning, starting to hold conversations, starting to get to know someone, maybe just the experience of being in a large group of people, maybe all singing together, maybe all chanting together, meditating together, whichever form it takes, praying together. Maybe the start of someone starting to feel a sense of belonging, of security, of safety, of feeling understood and valued, which sounds to me to be a good thing. But of course, we need to also consider that groups can be very difficult and that people can claim to be well-meaning when they're not. And therefore, the vulnerability of the person also needs to be taken into account. So I just wonder now if anybody would like to get in contact with me, whether it's to seek some help regarding their own experiences or of a family or for a family, then please do get in contact. You're very welcome to. My email address is HELENHOLMES, Helen Holmes 009@gmail.com. My telephone number, my professional telephone number is 07952 717 951. I look forward to hearing from you. And I'm here, having honed my skills over a long period of time, equipped to help the most vulnerable. I want to help as many people as I can whilst I'm on this planet. So please feel welcome to contact me. And I have a sliding scale of fees, so I can discuss that with you. Thank you very much for listening to my short video, and I hope that it's been of some help. Take care. Bye-bye.